So, welcome everyone. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Omer Aviv. I'm the creator of Ozcode and the CTO of our company, Code Value DT. We're based out of Israel. I'm mostly just define myself as somebody who cares very deeply about developers being productive day in, day out. Now, the reason I wanted to do this presentation today is because I know we've got a lot of newcomers. Some of you must have been folks that have recently heard about Ozcode through our Black Friday sale. And I want to get you up to speed and make sure that you're making the most out of Ozcode, because I feel very strongly that every single minute that we spend using the debugger is essentially just a minute that we squander away, right? While we're using the debugger, we're not writing a new feature, we're not refactoring to improve the quality of our existing code base. We're really just fixing something that really shouldn't have been there in the first place. So today will be a very technical session to try and see as many techniques as we can to hopefully make sure you're spending as little time as possible in the debugger and you have more time for the fun parts of programming, creating cool new features, drinking coffee, all the good stuff. I think there are really only two ways to use a debugger. One of them is a complete and utter waste of your time, and the other is what I call having quality time with the debugger. And I think it's a subtle but important distinction to make. It's real easy to know when somebody is wasting their time using the debugger. You sort of see them staring blankly at the computer screen and their fingers go for that F10, 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 F10 over and over and over again. And if you walk past, you realize that person really has no idea what it is they're doing. Whereas having quality time with the debugger is when we apply the scientific method religiously. So if you know by the time your finger goes for that F5 button, what your hypothesis is, what your theory is of why the code is not behaving the way you expected it to behave, and then you either prove or disprove that hypothesis and immediately move on to the next hypothesis, right? That's the only truly correct way to debug. But of course, that's much easier said than done. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my personal journey as a developer. So I started out at my very first job. I was working in medical imaging on the software that the doctors and the technicians at the hospital used to operate a CT scanner. And every 6 months or so, they used to take us out to the hospital to actually see how our software is being put to use. And I just remember having a very, very hard time. I was so scared, sitting there in my chair in the X-ray room and staring at the computer screen and thinking to myself, well, I really, really hope this thing doesn't crash, because if it does and they have to deliver a double dosage of radiation to that patient over there, they're probably going to want a better answer than just null reference was not set to an instance of a variable, right? So I was very afraid. And at that point, I decided to quit my job because I had this realization that every single moment that we suffer in the debugger is really because the real challenge in debugging is equal parts intellectual and psychological, right? Because when we're using the debugger, we're often trying to solve the same problem for an hour, and then another hour, and then yet another hour. And when we keep on failing at it, the psychology of failure kicks in, and that's where we usually get into that zombie mode of debugging, when we're just mindlessly stepping through code, not really knowing what it is we're doing. So to summarize this more spiritual part of the lecture, right before we jump into Visual Studio, I'd say that debugging is extremely complicated, frustrating, stressful. It's never planned. It's never accounted for in our sprint schedule, right? We don't say, well, this chunk of work is going to take 2 weeks, and then there's the other 2 weeks we don't like to talk about, where we'll be debugging all these horrible bugs we don't even know we have just yet. And so the only real cure is to know your tools, to know the power, the immense power of the Visual Studio Debugger itself, and the even greater power that Ozcode bakes on top of that. And that is what will hopefully save you from spending hours and hours and hours stepping through code. Now, today will be a very technical session. From this moment on, no more slides, just Visual Studio. But before we jump into Visual Studio, I want to try and make sure we make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to open up my trusty Notepad++ here. And I want to write down, so please type into the chat window any things you'd like to know about, things that are hard for you to debug. What are some of the code patterns or the types of code that are extremely tricky, or the things you find yourself spending the most time on while you're debugging? So go ahead and write into the chat window or the Q&A window. I'm going to start the presentation, but I'm also going to address your feedback as we go through this. So feel free to ask questions whenever you want, or use the raise your hand button if you prefer to use the microphone. I really, really encourage you to ask questions. Tell me what it is that's hard for you to debug, and I'll try to address your particular needs as we go through the presentation. Now, to start off with, I'm going to quickly cover the basics of Ozcode. The basics of Ozcode is you install Ozcode on top of your Visual Studio, you get a much stronger data tip window, and the data tip is, of course, the window we get when we hover over a variable. And what you'll see here is that what you find is that there's immense power inside this little window. Because, for example, right now I've got a list of customers, but nobody bothered to implement the toString method on the customer class. So what I can do is I can simply go in and star, for example, the full name and the ID properties. And from this moment on, every time I see a customer, Ozcode will always remember that full name and ID are the fields and properties that I actually care about. Now, you'll also notice that it's updated the heads-up display right here. So this heads-up display is showing me the current item in the for each loop, and as soon as I change the stars, it updated right away. Now, I can even take this ability to the extreme. So let's say every customer has an address, and every address has a zip code, and I'd really like to see the zip code of each and every one of these customers, but without having to go individually into each one and open it up. I can simply start the nested property, the zip code, inside the address, and then start the address inside the customer, and there we go. I can now see the zip code for each and every one of these customers at the top level. I didn't have to sweat too much to get to it. Now, the next couple of things I want to show you are part of the upcoming version 3.5 of Ozcode. So really cool new features that we're really excited about. One of them is that we drastically improved the search functionality in Ozcode, which is something that's always been there. We just made it faster, better, slicker. So for example, let's say I want to find a customer named Michael in this collection, but I don't want to scroll through this entire thing. I can just type in Michael. Now you'll notice that it's giving me a suggestion here. So it's telling me there's a Michael Ford, there's a Michael E. Ford email address, and I can pick whatever one I want. And it will, when I do that, it will actually highlight all the different Michaels that we have here, right? So I see, and I can scroll through them and see them one by one. Now the really interesting bit is that I can also filter this down to see only the fields and properties that have the word Michael in them. But the really cool thing here is that when I perform the initial search after that first time I hit enter, Ozcode has indexed through all of the items in this collection. So if you notice, for example, we've got a gender property here. If it's a male or a female. Well, I can just, by simply typing in the word female, Ozcode will immediately update and find all the females, right? And I can just filter this down, see exactly who the females are. But there's an even nicer way to do this now. So I'll close this down, and rather than do a search, a text search, which is the default, I'll do a condition search. So this is more like a filtering. So when I do a filter, I can use this special obj keyword, which basically denotes the current object. This obj is a special Ozcode thing. So I can type, for example, obj. Well, I could do something on the gender. Let's try doing something a bit more interesting. Like I'll say, give me just the ones where the first name starts with the letter R, for example. Hit enter, and boom, Ozcode immediately searches through the collection. It finds just the ones where the 5 instances where we've got a first name starting with R. So we've got Roberta here, we've got Robert, and et cetera, et cetera. And you notice that as I scroll through, we got these little green things here on the scroll bar helping me see where are the items that match this condition. How are they distributed through this collection? So if we try to do a little different trick, let's do first name dot length, and I can put really any C# expression that I want here, any predicate at all. I can say, give me just the ones where their first name is larger than the 2 characters. Well, that's everyone. Let's do 3, a bit less, 4, we see even less, 5, 6. So you see that we can see, well, how many have we got where the first name is larger than 7 characters, 8 characters, 9 characters? Boom, there's nobody with a first name larger than 9 characters, thank God. So that's a really easy and fun and really simple way to experiment and find just the items in the collections that you actually care about. And again, just like we saw before with the textual search, I can do a filter to give me just the ones where just the items that match, right? So when I click this guy right here, it will filter this list down to show me just the people whose first name is larger than 7 characters long. All right, so that's coming soon in version 3.5 of Ozcode. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and continue through seeing the rest of these features. How well does this function work with large collections, 1K, 10K, 1 million? Okay, great question. So search is actually improved very dramatically in terms of speed. You'll see it work extremely well with collections of up to hundreds of thousands. We're working to make even millions of items work right now. We're at a place where hundreds of thousands of items are good, but there's something really important to mention about performance, and that has to do with this little button you see right here. So that actually both of these buttons have to do with performance. So first of all, there's this button right here. When I click on this button, what it does is it actually filters this down so that it's a little toggle button that that basically means that we're only going to search through fields and auto properties, okay? And why is that important? Well, sometimes you have a getter of a property that's doing some insane amount of work, like it's going off to the database or it's doing some crazy calculations. That's probably a pretty a bad coding pattern, but we can control all of the code in our code base, or it might even be some third-party library that's doing that. And if you have a getter that's taking an extremely long time to execute, your search will be extremely slow and annoying, right? Because our Ozcode search is capable of going through hundreds of thousands of properties and fields in just a few seconds. But if your property getter takes 10 seconds, we can't make that any faster. So by enabling this button, you'll make sure that we only search through fields and not auto properties and not regular properties. So if you have problems with some getters in your code that are taking too long, that will sort that out. Now, the other notion about performance is that you can control the search depth. So that basically means how deep into this object graph we're going to go. Initially, it only searches 2 levels deep, but every time you click this button, it will search deeper and deeper into your object graph. So that's another way in which we control the performance to make sure that the initial search is as fast as we can make it. Okay, hope that answered your question there. All right, let's and please keep the questions going, guys. I'd really love to take your feedback. Hit me up with any questions if anything's not clear, if you want more information. Next thing I want to talk about is the heads-up display. So you see here that Ozcode gives you quite a lot of functionality in terms of seeing what's going on in your code as you're stepping on through. So for example, I'm about to step into the switch statement, and Ozcode tells me, well, you're going to go here to this case clause. So the irrelevant case clause is de-emphasized for me. Now, where this gets really helpful is when I have a long, complicated Boolean expression, like, for example, this one right here. So let's say I wanted to know why is this if statement returning true, or why is this if statement returning false. Well, if I don't have Ozcode, I'd probably have to take each one individually, put it into the watch or the quick watch or the immediate window and say, well, this one's false. Let's look at the other one, also false. Let's look at the other one. I sort of have to do all the Boolean logic in my head. Whereas with Ozcode, I can just look at these colors, right? Simple enough. That's real easy. And these colors tell me, well, red means false, green means true. I see that we're going to go here. This entire if statement is true. That's what this green V right here signifies. And that's why the else clause is de-emphasized for me. And now, if I want more information, I can just click this button right here to drill in. And then I can use either the keyboard or the mouse to navigate through. So I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard, or I can use my mouse to navigate here and see all the different parts of the expression. So I can say, well, why was this false? Because this is not the same as this. And why was this expression false? Well, that's because this number is not larger than that number. And here we were comparing Visa to Visa. That's why this is true. Now, the really cool thing about this functionality is that it works really well with edit and continue. And edit and continue, for those of you who might not be familiar, is the ability to change my code while I'm debugging. So, and that's something that Microsoft radically improved in Visual Studio 2015 and improved even further in Visual Studio 2017. So if you might remember, if you're a veteran and Visual Studio user, in previous versions like Visual Studio 2013 and below, there were a lot of limitations. Like if you try to change your code while you're debugging, it usually just broke down, complaining about things such as, well, edit and continue doesn't support, it isn't supported if your method has any lambda expressions in it, and it wasn't supported if you were doing async programming, or if you were doing 64-bit debugging. There were all these limitations. And then in Visual Studio 2015, Microsoft basically rewrote the edit and continue feature from scratch as part of the Roslyn project, the rewriting of the C# compiler in C#, and made it just wonderful to work with. In terms of, rather than having to stop the debugger, make some bug fix, some small change to my code, then to see if that change actually fixed the thing I was hoping to fix, I have to restart the debugger, recompile everything, reproduce all the steps to make the breakpoint hit, and so on and so forth. All of that long and painful feedback cycle just goes away, becomes much, much shorter. And Ozcode makes that even better by giving you this ability of live coding. So live coding means that this prediction of what's going to happen in the debugger will be updated every time you make a change. So for example, I'm going to change this to say so that the first expression here is going to return true. So now I'll just change this to an equal instead of a not equal, and boom. As soon as I lifted my finger from the keyboard, Ozcode immediately updates and tells me, well, now this expression is returning true, so the rest of the expressions won't even be evaluated, right? Because we had a short circuit evaluation here. So that's the power of live coding. I can make changes to my code, and the results will immediately be reflected before I even hit F5 to continue. The other thing I can do is I can change the values of variables, right? So I can go in here, change the value of customer to null, hit enter. And that's something that's really powerful to do because I can experiment with how this code would behave on different types of situations. For example, now when I've changed the value of customer to null, Ozcode is telling me a null reference is going to occur here, and we're going to break. So always remember that you can change the values of variables while you're debugging. Extremely easy way to experiment and see what your code is doing. Okay. So one other thing I wanted to mention about the heads-up display is that it can also show you the past, not just the future. So you know that experience where sometimes you hit F10, 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 and you step all the way down to the bottom of your code, and then you're like, oh damn, I hit F10 one too many times. Now I'm gonna have to rerun this entire method or the entire program just to get back to where I was. Well, with Ozcode, you don't have that anymore. You can just click this button right here. It says View Historical Results. And when I click that, it shows me exactly what happened here. So I can see, for example, here, total price was 30, we added 21, got 51 out. as the new value. And here we did 51 plus this number gave us the return value of this method. And here we put 21 as a string into try parse. Try parse return true. That's why this is green. And we got 21 out as an integer. Now, if I want to see sort of everything all at once, I can just change this so that instead of only showing values on the yellow line, the last line that's going to be executed, I can say show values everywhere. And that will give me one line of summary above each line of code. And I can quickly toggle this on and off using a shortcut, which is Shift-Alt-Q. It's called the magic glance. Shift-Alt-Q. So with just one press on my keyboard, I can toggle this on and off. Now, if you feel like this is too colorful and sort of looks like a Christmas tree and it's not even Christmas yet, you can make this a lot less colorful, but just going into here, into Customize Ozcode Experience. And then you can play around with all the colors, with the font sizes, or you can just opt to go into the minimalistic theme, which will make everything more grayed down and make all the fonts and the colors look just like the and match the code lens experience, because Ozcode is essentially a code lens for the Visual Studio Debugger, in a sense. Now, I'm gonna switch right back to the classic theme because I'm an old-fashioned guy, but you can change that to suit your liking. Okay, now I want to talk about some more hardcore debugging features, some of the lesser-known features in Ozcode. One of the features that I personally really like to use quite often is compare. So compare is basically the ability to take two objects and compare them, just like you would compare two source files, two CS files in a diff viewer. Just we're doing it for objects and collections in the debugger. So here, for example, I have a problem with serialization. I have a phone book object right here. I'm serializing it into a memory stream, and then I'm deserializing it back out. And when I take it out, I see that something's wrong because the original phone book and the one we just serialized and deserialized are not the same, and I want to know why. So what I'll do is I'll hit compare this on the phone book object, and you see that Ozcode is asking me what I want to compare the phone book with, and it's highlighting loaded phone book because Ozcode knows that I can compare any two objects that are the same type or derived from the same type. So I'll go ahead to loaded phone book, click right here to add it to the comparison candidate list. Right now I'm only going to compare two variables, but I can compare up to 5 variables at a time. Hit compare, and now what we're seeing here is that Ozcode is showing me the two objects side by side, the phone book and the one I serialized and deserialized. And right away I can see the problem, right? I can see that here I've got proper ages, and here the ages are all zeros, so I can already figure out, well, probably the issue is that I forgot to serialize the age property. Okay, that's simple enough. There's another cute little thing here in that if you have two string properties that are very long, like XML or JSON documents, you can click this button right here, and that will open up the two strings in your favorite diff viewer. So for me personally, I like to use Beyond Compare, but you can easily go into Ozcode Options, diff tool, and pick whatever diff tool you like to use. Alrighty. Another nice way of doing comparisons, so we got an assertion failure because these two objects are not the same, but we're going to get another assertion failure in here. So this is very similar to the previous sample, only this time around, instead of having two variables, I've just got one variable. Oh, wow, John Holland just asked, what scopes does the compare feature work in? Could you save an object from inside a previous function? Well, that's an amazing question because it's exactly the thing that I was just going to show right now. Thank you, John, for your question. So here, I've got a phone book again. I'm serializing and deserializing it into a memory stream. And here, instead of having two variables like we did before, phone book and loaded phone book, I've just got one variable, just phone book. So if I hit F10 one more time, this phone book variable is going to be overwritten with the information from this memory stream, and it's going to be gone forever. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna again hover over the phone book, click on compare this. Now I'm going to click on this icon that looks like a little camera because I want to essentially take a photo of the current state of this object. And then I'm going to be able to give this snapshot a name. So I'm going to call this phone book before deserialization. And I'm going to hit OK. Now I save the snapshot of the phone book, and now I'm going to hit F10. Okay, so now the phone book variable has changed, and I'm going to click on compare this again, and then I'm going to choose to compare phone book with the snapshot that I had just taken a moment ago. And I see the exact results that I did before, only now I'm comparing the same object across different points in time. Now, the really cool thing here is that these snapshots are persisted. So even if I step into a different method, even if I close the debugger and debug a different program even, or even if I close down Visual Studio and come back tomorrow, those snapshots are still persisted, and I can always go back and compare any object that is the same type or derived from the same type against the snapshots that I had saved before. Okay? Alrighty. Another question in the chat. Alexander asks, can you search in data table? So I believe so, but there are the data sets and data tables are a bit tricky. Your mileage may vary in terms of using them with the Ozcode functionality. If you do find any problems with that, please let me know. I'm just saying because I know that those are extremely difficult to look at when you're using the debugger. I'm not sure whether Ozcode has particular help for that. But please do give us your feedback if you think that we could do a better job in terms of helping you with old style ADO.NET data sets and data tables. Alrighty, so that insertion failure yet again. Let's, as we expected, let's talk about some other hardcore debugging features. So one of the lesser known but really powerful features in Ozcode is custom expressions. Custom expressions is, of course, the ability to add a custom expression that is a calculation upon my object to the way the debugger shows me this object. Why would I want that? Well, let's take an example here. I've got a list of method info objects. So these objects all represent different methods we have in .NET. And what I'd really like to know about these objects is how many parameters does each one of these methods have? So I open one of them naively and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll some more. And unfortunately, there's really nothing here that tells me how many parameters this method has. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to right-click and add custom expression. Now you notice also that these method info objects are not even my code, right? I didn't write it. It's part of .NET Reflection. So even if I wanted to add the new property to it or change the toString just to improve the way the debugger shows me this object, that's not really an option. So I'm going to click on Add Custom Expression right here. And now Ozcode sort of adds something that looks like a new property into this object. And you notice that it's giving me the obj keyword, the special keyword that denotes the current object, like we saw before in the conditional search feature. And here I'm going to type in whatever C# expression I want on this method info object. So I'm going to say obj.getParameters.count. And using C# common syntax, I can give this custom expression a friendly name. So I'm going to call this param count. I hit enter, and boom, it suddenly looks as though I've got a new property inside of this object. But it's not really a new property. It's just something that's going to help me debug this thing. So now I can start the custom expression, and I guess I'll also start the full name, for example. And voila, I just forced the debugger to show me this collection by presenting the fields and properties that I actually care about. I'm making the debugger work for me rather than doing a lot of work to appease the debugger. All right, so that was custom expressions. I want to talk a little bit about working with exceptions. Exceptions can be a real pain, especially when you have an exception that's thrown and then caught and rethrown and then caught yet again, by the time we actually see it, it's usually really hard to figure out where that exception actually came from. What you usually end up doing is you go here into View Details, and you go into the inner exception, and the inner exception, and the inner exception. And you try to look up the stack trace and probably copy paste this into Notepad just so that you can figure out what line of code that actual original exception came from. Well, the good news is that with Ozcode, you don't need to do any of that. You can just look at this annotation here that's telling you this is the exception type, this is the exception message, and this tells us we've got 3 inner exceptions. So when I click this, this will open up the exception trail window. And the exception trail window is essentially a fully featured multi-level exception viewer. So I can go into each and every inner exception and see the stack trace, which is fully interactive. So I can click around here and it will take me through the route that the exception was propagated through. Usually though, what I really want to know is I want to go to the innermost frame of the innermost stack trace, right? I want to see the original exception that caused all of this. And that's exactly what this button right here does. So I click on go to where exception was thrown. I see that it took me to a null reference exception in this line of code right here. And I can already figure out that probably the issue here is that invoice was null. And if I don't know what a null reference exception is, because I'm just that good a programmer that I don't know, never had that before, I can very easily click on Google or Stack Overflow, of course, like a good developer would, and with just one click, it will take me to people on Stack Overflow that maybe have more experience than I. And of course, we've got a new feature, Bing, so don't worry, you can also search Bing. We've been showing this feature at Microsoft conferences, and now you know that we're politically correct. You can also search Bing. There you go. Okay, let's see. Colby Brown asks, if an inner exception is a custom expression with extra properties, how will they be displayed? That's a great question. So if you're, it doesn't matter what type of exception it is, and if it has its own special properties, you'll see all the properties right here down below in the exception viewer. So right here I've got regular old exceptions, but if this had some special property that's particular to that type of exception, you'll see it right here below. And the really cool thing, by the way, is that now if I stop the debugger, that information didn't disappear. I can always get back to it by going to Ozcode View Exceptions, even after I stop the debugger. And now when I'm fixing the exception, I can always go back and look at all these properties and look at the old stack trace and see how I want to fix the particular exception, even after I stop the debugger. Okay. Dennis asks, can we use the feature? Wait, I lost your question. Just a sec. Can we use this feature or similar with remotely traced exceptions or dumps? This particular feature does not yet support remote debugging, but the next version of Ozcode has quite a lot of amazing features for working with dumps and remote or production debugging. So there's lots of amazing stuff that's going to pop up in Ozcode version 4.0 that hopefully will answer your needs there, Dennis. So look out for more information on that early next year. I'd say first quarter of 2018, we'll start dishing out more information about that. All right. So let's see what other magic tricks we've got to talk about. I would say one of the Dennis asks, does every release come with a webinar like this one? Absolutely. Every release of Ozcode, we'll be doing a new webinar to show the new features. There's also going to be a Channel 9 video in January of 2018 with yours truly on the Visual Studio Toolbox show with Robert Green on the Microsoft Channel 9 website, where that's going to be the exclusive unveiling of some of the amazing new features that are coming out in Ozcode version 4.0. So you can look out for that in January of 2018, and shortly after we'll probably do also another webinar with even more cool new features. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about setter breakpoints. Setter breakpoints are, and setter trace points are basically the ability to say, I want to break not on a particular line of code, but I want to break when a particular value changes. And that's a particularly useful thing when we have these bugs that have to do with mutating state. Like the object changes, it's sort of a complementary thing to the compare functionality that we saw before. Because some of the trickiest bugs are when an object state has changed, but we're not sure exactly when and where and how, and we want to find out. So here I've got a memory stream, and I'm just serializing a bunch of customer information into it. And let's say, for the sake of example, that I have a problem where the memory usage goes rampant, and I want to get a breakpoint whenever the size of the internal buffer of this memory stream goes deeper. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the capacity property here. And I'm going to use the Ozcode magic wand. And the magic wand is sort of like the bearer of good news. This is Ozcode telling you there's all sorts of useful things you could do with this particular object or this particular property. And I'm going to say when set break. And notice that I've got two options here, when set break and when set trace. Let's start with when set break. So I do when set break. And Ozcode is telling me we're going to break when capacity property is set on, and I can choose whether I want this on this particular memory stream or any memory stream in the system. And I can also choose a condition, so I can say only when the value that it's being set to is larger than a certain number. I won't do that for now. I'll hit OK. And now when I run this program forward, you'll see that we break into the debugger. And it's telling me the reason we got a breakpoint is because the value of capacity is being set to this number on this particular memory stream. And next one, we got, now it's being set to 512. And I hit F5 again, and it will say 1024. Now, this happens to be the line of code where the property is changed. But if it was a different line of code, it doesn't matter. It will take me to whatever line of code that particular property was changed in. And you'll notice that memory stream is not even part of my code, right? It's somebody from Microsoft wrote that. That doesn't stop me from putting a breakpoint on it. And I look at the callstack window, I see that Ozcode broke into the set of breakpoints demo, but the actual change happened way deep in here inside of the memory stream binary writer.write blah 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 blah. Okay, so that's the cool thing about setter breakpoints, is that they will work no matter where the actual setting, the actual assigning of the property happened, even if it's third-party code. Okay, now Davey Walred, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I didn't. Does Ozcode also have some functions for debugging across different threads? Absolutely, and that's actually, in my opinion, the best features for working with multi-threaded code is tracepoints. So tracepoint, if you're not familiar, is the ability to add some logging to your program while you're debugging it. Because if you think about it, when you try to debug a multi-threaded program, the normal way we know how to debug, which is just to set a breakpoint and hit F10, 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 that whole approach pretty much breaks down, right? Because what will happen in pretty much 100% of the cases is that we'll hit a breakpoint, hit F10 a few times, and suddenly we'll get a breakpoint on a different thread. And then we'll hit F10 a few more times, and we'll get an exception on yet another thread. And it just quickly becomes a problem of trying to juggle too many balls in my head at once, right? My head just explodes. So a trace point is really, really useful in that respect. So I'm going to start off by showing you a special kind of trace point, which is the setter trace point. So you see that I've got a setter breakpoint on the capacity property here, right here. I'm going to delete that, and instead I'm going to create a setter trace point. So I'm going to say when set trace. And we see again that Ozcode is telling me we're going to write a trace message whenever the capacity property is being set. And I can choose whether I want this on this particular memory stream or any memory stream. And it's telling me capacity was set to this number. So this is the trace point message. The way it works is that inside these curly braces, I can put any C# expression that I want. And down here, it will show me a preview of what that tracing message is going to look like. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to remove this breakpoint right here, and I'm going to run the program forward. Now, what we see, if we look down here at the bottom right corner of my screen, we see that these messages are all coming in. And when I click that, it opens up the Tracepoints Viewer. And the Tracepoint Viewer is essentially a fully featured log viewer that we've baked into Visual Studio. So it has all the things you'd expect out of a fully featured log viewer, like searching and filtering and all of that. So for example, if this was a multi-threaded program, I could filter this by thread ID and see what each thread was doing at a time. And here I can see the stack trace of where that message came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a setter trace point. Let's also show the normal trace points. So normal trace point would be, just going into a particular line of code. Let's say I've got a problem with the expected delivery date here, that sometimes it's in the year 2020. And I'm not sure why. Why is it going rampant in some cases, but it's perfectly fine in the year 2017 in other cases. So what I'll do is I'll just, again, go to my trusty magic wand, say create trace point with value. Okay, so I've created a trace point. You'll notice that rather than a circle like a breakpoint, this is a diamond because it's a trace point. And inside these curly braces, I can put any C# expression that I want. So I can say, for example, give me the day of week, or I could call a method here. I could say add days, add 10 days. I can do pretty much anything that I want. Now, because I don't know what information might be relevant, might be important to log, I'll just go ahead and add everything. And Ozcode gives me a really super easy way to do that. I can just click this button right here. While the tracepoint editor is open, I just click this button that says add to tracepoint. So I'm going to add the destination and the ID and the item and the quantity. And you see they're all added up at the top here. And this preview shows me what this logging is going to look like. I hit OK, run the program forward, and there we go. So these messages are all coming into the Tracepoint Viewer. And again, this is a fully featured log viewer. So because the only thing I know about this bug is that it has something to do with the year 2020, I can just do a search. So I type in 2020, hit enter, and I can immediately see that all these orders are the ones going to Paris, right? So that was the power of trace points. You can add logging to your program while you're debugging, and be able to change them dynamically whenever you want. Now, trace points aren't really an Ozcode thing. They're a Visual Studio feature that Ozcode just makes better. What do I mean by that? You can add your own trace point with a Visual Studio without even having Ozcode installed through the Actions window here, where you go in and you say, log a message to the output window whenever we get hit this trace point. But the problem with doing that is that when you do that, all your output is going here into the output window, along with all the junk that goes into the output window, which makes it a lot harder to see. So that's the power of the Ozcode trace points. Okay, so one of the coolest features in Ozcode version 3, and this is probably the most influential features of Ozcode in general, is the link debugging functionality. That's one we released on the very same day that Visual Studio 2017 came out. We sim-shipped Ozcode version 3.0. And the whole idea behind the link debugging functionality is that we felt very strongly that right now, whenever you use link, you're sort of making a sacrifice, right? If you write your code in as long link queries like this one, you're essentially sacrificing the debuggability of your code for its readability. You get code that's a lot nicer to look at, a lot nicer to read, more functional, more declarative, and more succinct. But at the same time, it's a lot less debuggable, because if you try to step over a big link query like this one, it either finished or it threw an exception, but you have no idea what actually happened inside. So we wanted to change all of that. And that's why we created the new link debugging experience. And I'll show you how that works. So I've got a beautiful poem that I wrote here. As you can see, it's very, very artistic. And I've got a link query, and I'm going to sing it to you right now. It goes 99 little bugs in the code, 99 bugs in the code. Take one down, patch it around, 127 bugs in the code. Repeat until no more bugs. And as you can imagine, singing this song 20 times every hour when you're at a conference really takes a toll. So I usually don't do it anymore. But I've got this link query right here, and that's going to try and help me figure out what is the word that appears most frequently inside of this poem. And I've got an assertion failure that's about to happen, right? So we've got predictive analysis here. Ozcode is telling me if I hit F10 one more time, I'm going to get this assertion failure exploding in my face. Because we were expecting this link algorithm to return the word bugs, but it's actually returning the word code right now. And if I look close, I see that the word bugs appears 1, 2, 3, 4 times, but the word code only appears 1, 2, 3 times. So this definitely should have been the word bugs, and I want to figure out why this happened. So I'm going to go back, and the first thing you'll notice is we've got these numeric indicators that are telling me how many items came from each part of the link query. Now, thankfully, these are also part of the live coding experience that I showed you before. So if I make changes to this link query with edit and continue, these numbers will update in real time, and we'll see that in just a moment. But first, I'll just click on one of these guys, and that takes me into a link debugging mode, okay? And inside link debugging mode, Ozcode basically shows me the flow of the query, how all the different items sort of went from one place to another. Now, so we begin with 99, which is the first word in our poem here. So we see that 99 came from split, then the where clause returned true, that's why it's green. Then we group by the word itself, and we order by how many times it appeared in the poem. So I see that 99 appears 1, 2. That's why this lambda expression returned the number 2. Now, the cool thing here is that I can go to any item and sort of see what happened to it. So, for example, if I choose the string empty, I see that the where clause returned false, and that's why it didn't carry on through to the rest of the link pipeline. And speaking of the where clause, if I hover over the little numeric indicator next to the where clause, it opens up to explore the where operator. And I can decide if I want to see the 79 items that came in or the 29 items that came out. And when I look at these guys, then the red-green indicators on the right-hand side tell me whether the predicate returned true or false for each one of these items. Now, I still haven't solved this bug. Now, I'm going to need some more information. So I'm going to open up the link analysis window, and that's available either through this button right here, or I could just go here and open it right there. And the link analysis window basically just gives you more insight into what the link query is doing. So, for example, right now I'm looking at group by right here. And on the left-hand side, I'm seeing all the items that came in. And on the right-hand side, I'm seeing all the groups that came out. So, and this is fully interactive. So I can click anywhere I want here, and it will show me what happened to that particular item. So again, the only thing I know about this bug is that it has something to do with the word bugs, right? So I'm going to type in bugs, hit enter. And then I'm also going to filter this down like we saw before. And now I can see exactly what the problem is. I can see that we've got these 3 instances of the word bugs going inside of this group, but I've got another instance of the word bugs that's going into an entirely different group. So I actually have 2 problems to solve. First, I need to take care of the casing issue. I don't care if it's lowercase or uppercase, it's still the same word. And I also need to remove this closing parenthesis at the end. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to exit the link debugging mode, but I'm going to do that with live coding. So if you see, if you look close, you see that right now we've got 79 items coming from split here. So I'm going to go ahead and add the missing separators, the open parentheses and the closing parentheses, and boom. As soon as I lift my fingers from the keyboard, it immediately updates and tells me, whoa, and now we've got 81 items. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Next is you see that we've got 19 items coming from the group by, right? Because the lowercase and the uppercase are going into different groups, of course. So I'm going to fix that by saying select I goes to I to lower. And again, as soon as I lift my finger off the keyboard, we see now we've got 18 items here, right? So now I just got to hit F10. Whoops, not F5, F10, sorry. Let me go back. Yeah, go here. And ta-da, I see that we solved the problem. Alrighty, so that was link debugging, part 1 at least. There will be a part 2 in just a few minutes. I'm going to take a break from talking about link to show you another cool feature that has a lot to do with test-driven development and you know, just a better way to handle bugs in general. I feel very strongly that again, part of this whole session is just looking at different ways we can avoid spending too much time being unproductive in the debugger. And I think one of the best ways to be successful at debugging is if you're able to take the bug and understand it well enough to create a unit test or an integration test, you know, or even just a throwaway console app around that bug. Because that's essentially like you know, putting the bug in a room that has no doors and no windows, right? The bug has nowhere to escape. And you get the nice added bonus where you know that you've got a regression test covering that bug so that it won't creep into the system sneakily a year later. But of course, like all unit testing and advice, that's a lot easier said than done. It's just something that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and sometimes we get lazy. So, because we're just humans after all. So I'm going to show you a quick feature that makes it, turns your laziness into good laziness. So let's say I've been debugging for 2 hours now, and I try to put a breakpoint here, try to put a breakpoint there. Eventually, after a lot of hard work and research, I find that this particular customer, this Lois, is the one that's causing an exception or causing the system to crash. And I want to create a unit test or an integration test around this particular object. So again, I'm going to hover over it, go to my trusty magic wand, and say export. Okay? When I do export, Ozcode gives me a textual representation of this object, and I can have that textual representation as C# code, for example. So now all I need to do is copy this to clipboard, paste it into my unit test, and I can get up and running very, very quickly. I can also have this output as XML or JSON using JSON.NET, the industry standard JSON serializer, which is very cool. And I can even save this to a file and just send it to somebody over email. Another nice way of exporting is export to Excel. So whenever I'm looking at a list or a collection or array, dictionary, whatever, I can say export to Excel. And Ozcode will create an Excel sheet where every field and property in my object essentially becomes a column in Excel. So I can do whatever Excel-y things I want to do. I can create a graph. I can make a pivot table, all that Excel-y goodness I want to do with this data. Alrighty. Now, to wrap up here, by the way, last chance, if anybody has any questions, we're just a few minutes away from finishing. So please give me all your questions. I'd love to address your feedback. Another thing you should know, by the way, is that if you are one of the, and I'm imagining most of you are, because this webinar is mostly targeted for newcomers through our Black Friday sale. If you have other coworkers that you'd like to add into your new Black Friday subscription, that 75% of Black Friday discount is applicable to anybody you add within your first year. So if you have some more colleagues that you think would also enjoy using Ozcode, you can add them to your subscription, and it will and that 75% Black Friday discount will still apply, even if you add them today, tomorrow, or even next month. It doesn't matter, or 2 months from now, for that matter. So that's another little tip for you there. Finally, let's talk about the link debugging feature. Now, you guys have asked me a lot of really great questions today. I want to ask you a question for once. So I want to know, and let's do a quick survey here. Do you guys prefer to use the link fluent syntax, like the one we saw in the previous demo and the one we see up here? Or do you prefer to use the query syntax, like the one we see down here at the bottom? Which one do you prefer to use? So please go ahead and then write that into your chat window. Fluent if you prefer fluent syntax, or query if you prefer the SQL style thing we have below. So we've got fluent, 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 one for query. Thanks, Colby, for going non-mainstream. Subvert dominant paradigm is what I always say. So Colby and Philippe say query, everyone else say fluent. Okay, so that's really great, because everybody that said fluent, I'm gonna question, sort of challenge your thinking there, and I'm gonna show you an example where, in my opinion, the fluent syntax is really, really bad in this particular scenario, and actually the query is much better. I myself am more of a fluent guy, but I do think that there are certain instances where the query just makes a lot more sense. So in this example, what we're doing is we're trying to find all the best students in the university. So I'm saying from each department in the university, I'm using the let keyword, which is actually one of my favorite keywords in the C# language. It's very functional, very mathematical-like. I can say, calculate the department average as the average grade of all students within that department. And then from each student in that department, give me just the ones where their grade is above average, again, within that department. And then select out just the names of those good students. Now, I could do the same thing using the fluent syntax, because having two froms, as I do down here, is just like doing a select many in the fluent syntax. And using the let keyword is just like doing a select with an anonymous type. That's really what the compiler is translating that to anyways behind the scenes. But I think you'll all agree that this up here is kind of and this below is actually really nice, right? It's taking a relatively complicated idea and expressing it in relatively very few lines of code. Now, the good news is that if you've got the version 3.1 of Ozcode at least, which is our latest stable release, then you'll see that a couple cool new things. First of all, you'll see that the query syntax is supported just the same, and I can go in here. Now, you see that, as is typical, nobody bothered to implement the toString method on student, and nobody bothered to implement toString on department either. But that's no problem. We're just going to go in here, and let's say for the student, I care about the grade, so I start the grade and I start the name. And for, let's say, the department, I want to see the ID and the name. There we go. Now I've got all the same functionality we saw before. I can see who the good students were, who the bad students were. I can see, for example, that in the mathematics department, the average grade was 44.8. But unfortunately, Barbara was not such a good student this year. She only got a 38. So the where clause returned false, and that's why she wasn't included in the list of good students. Now, the other cool new thing that we added in version 3.1 is this little pin button right here in the query analysis window. So this pin button will allow you to essentially take a chunk or a certain sub-segment of this query and see just the flow of information inside that chunk. So again, for example, in the link analysis window, I'm seeing the before and the after of each operator. So right now I'm looking at the select clause. So I'm seeing the student objects that came into the select clause, and on the right-hand side, I'm seeing just the strings that represent the names of those good students. Now let's say I want to know for each one of these good students what department they came from originally, from up here at the very top of the query. So I could pin to here or here. I'm actually going to pin all the way back to the very beginning of this query. And there we go. So now, right now, I can see that on the left-hand side, I'm seeing the departments that came in from here, from the very top of my query. And on the right-hand side, I'm seeing the good students that came from that department, okay? So that's what the pin button does. It allows me to select any chunk of the query and see how the information was transformed through that chunk. Okay. Dennis asks, how about breakpoints in the middle of the query? Well, my expectation, Dennis, is that using the link debugging functionality, hopefully you won't need that. You won't need to put a breakpoint inside the query, because the link debugging analysis should just give you all the information that you want. If you have any situations where that's not the case, please let us know so that we can make that better for you. Okay, so I see that we're just about out of time. Does anybody have any last questions before we wrap up? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Dum-da-dum. Okay, so with that, I'll say again, thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. It's been an extremely pleasant webinar for me. It's great to have newcomers. Thanks so much for being here. The recording of this session will be available, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues or have another look if you like. And we're